make sure that everything is working from a technology standpoint. So just give us a second. If you're out there, feel free to put in the comments that you can see and hear us, and let us know that everything is working well out there. So just give us 1 second. So we are going to be talking with Dr. Christina Abbuhl, and she is a child psychologist at Dayton Children's, which we're just double checking here. Thank you guys for waiting. Okay, so we are good to go. So let's get our conversation started. So Dr. Abbuhl, thank you so much for joining us today. Do you want to just give a little intro about who you are and what makes you a specialist on this topic?
Sure. So I'm a psychologist at Children's. I've been there about 5 years now. This area ends up being a specialty for me because my training is half in school psychology and half in clinical psychology. So you end up with the education side of things and then the clinical side of things with disorders like ADHD. I also run at the hospital a program that we have called Navigating ADHD, which is specifically a program designed for parents and kids in managing ADHD in general. So during this time with everybody trying to figure out how to be the teacher the best they can at home, this topic seems to fit with what I do on a regular basis. Seemed like a good fit to share with families right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for joining us from your home today as well. So let's dive in. And if people have questions as we talk, feel free to write them in the comments and we will answer them live. So let's just start with, what are some of the biggest challenges that parents might be dealing with while doing school at home with their child with ADHD?
Yeah, I would say one of the biggest issues is trying to figure out consistency is really important for ADHD, but at the same time, so is flexibility and choice. So that, I think, is the trickiest balance, is figuring out how much do I insist on sticking to a certain level of consistency and how much choice and flexibility do I allow. So for example, maybe not being flexible with what time we start homework time, but being flexible with which subject they get to start with, right? Or maybe not being willing to be flexible with they have to be at the table while they work, but being flexible with they can stand if they want to, or things like that. So trying to find the line that is consistent enough, but also allows a little bit of wiggle room without them getting out of hand, thinking that they can kind of run things. So I think that's a huge issue, is trying to find that balance that works for your child in that way. The other piece, of course, is just trying to figure out how to balance schooling one or more children and balancing just the demands of running a house in general.
Yes.
So that, I think, is a huge tricky part, is how do I be teacher and kind of homemaker at the same time?
Yeah. So let's dive into that question. How should parents maybe balance their attention with their other children and also with a child with ADHD?
Yeah. Well, the good thing is most of the things that I'll talk about today really are things that are probably going to be somewhat helpful for all of your children. So it's not necessarily that you have to implement this specific thing with your child with ADHD, but then your other children get left out. Really, most of the things that are going to help with ADHD are potentially going to be helpful for your other children and are definitely not going to hurt the other children. So in that sense, you can kind of use the same programs, sort of the same strategies. The other piece is you might have to think about how to stagger things, right? So there's going to be, your kid with ADHD might need a little bit more one-on-one time during some of their schoolwork than some of the other kids might. So trying to figure out how to balance times when other children could do things a little bit more independent when you're doing things with your child with ADHD who needs a little bit more one-on-one time. So I think, one, realizing that just because you're doing something specifically for your child with ADHD doesn't mean you can't use it with the other kids. And then second, realizing that scheduling is going to be super important and trying to kind of balance out when kids are doing which things so you can divide that attention a little bit better.
Okay. When should, I was talking about this with some other friends who have children with ADHD to kind of, get some ideas or questions before this broadcast. And one of them asked, when should parents maybe push their child to continue to doing the homework? When should they back off? They were saying, a lot of times it's just easier to kind of quit when the tears start, because we're all really stressed out right now. So
Yeah.
with a child with ADHD, how can a parent manage that, especially when they do have all these other things that they're trying to manage right now?
Yeah. I would say one of the biggest things, if you tend to know after a certain amount of time, they tend to start going downhill, or you just are aware of what their kind of early signs of getting kind of stressed and overwhelmed are, it's probably much better to try to do a brief pause or a brief break or just a change in what task you're doing before it gets to the point that there's tears and a breakdown, for a couple of reasons. One, the more they end up having kind of tears and breakdowns and just overwhelming kind of stress about it, the more they're not going to want to do it, which means you're going to have that more next time. Second, whether they realize it or not, right, children learn things. And so realizing that, oh, when it gets to this point, my body gets to escape this environment that's hard for me and I don't like. So then you end up getting a child who gets to the point of being upset in order to escape this situation, which is not a great idea either for long-term being able to accomplish this. So I would say the biggest thing is just try to plan for, if you know 15 minutes, say, is usually there about their max. Maybe plan on working for 12 and then taking a quick little break, right? Whether it's 5 minutes or whether it's not, we just walk a lap around the living room or some little thing to build in a break before it gets to that point is going to probably be a lot more pleasant for everybody.
Does it help to like set that expectation ahead of time or like set a timer or anything like that? Or is that usually not helpful?
It could help. It depends a little bit on the child and what kind of works for them. I would say as a parent, you definitely need to know where that limit is. And then it might be worth trying it both ways, kind of one way where we just work and then I just introduce a break in a certain amount of time. And then maybe another day try where we set a timer and we work for a certain amount of time. Some kids, the timer is helpful. They know how much longer they have to go. Some kids, it's not so helpful. I think it depends a little bit. It might be worth trying both ways.
Okay. How can parents help children with ADHD focus on learning, and how can they engage them in learning? I think, especially right now, like there's a lot of distractions. They're in a new environment. Their parents might also be working from home. So how can, what are some tips and tools for focusing?
Yeah, I would say one, just trying to make sure physical activity is a big part of the day. There's more and more research that suggests that being physically active helps curb some of that restlessness and inattentive kind of thing. So making sure that physical activity is a definite kind of planned part of your day. I would also say, again, like I mentioned earlier, trying to provide some consistency, but with a little bit of choice. We know, right, I'm sure many of you know that your kids with ADHD can focus a lot better on things that are interesting for them, right? So they can focus 3 hours on video games. That's because where ADHD becomes the biggest issue is when you have to try to make your brain focus, right? If it's engaging or stimulating, it's not as difficult. So the more choice you can give, usually the more motivation there is, which might make it a little bit more interesting. And then kind of related to that in general, the more you can make it interesting, the more you can make it so that kids can actively engage. So when I say that, I mean things like, rather than having to listen to you teach on something for 20 minutes, trying to find some way that they're actively doing something during that 20 minutes. Like maybe they're keeping a tally on a piece of paper of how many times you say dinosaur during the talk you're doing on dinosaurs, right? Or maybe some way that during math work, maybe you put different numbers up around the house, and when you give the addition question or multiplication question or whatever it is, they have to actively go get that number and bring it back, right? So trying to find ways to make sure they're active when we're teaching, and not necessarily active as in getting up, which can be helpful, but just doing something to keep them engaged while they're doing it. Again, trying to make sure they're physically active. Research suggests that morning tends to be a little better for kids with ADHD. Now,
Okay.
not right when they get up, right? You will, I'm sure many of you parents who have children with ADHD fully realize that morning routine can be not fun at all. But after that time, kind of after your breakfast, that kind of later morning time might be a little easier than sort of end of the day time. Now, kids vary a little bit, but in general, that tends to be better. And then there's two tools that I would strongly recommend parents looking into. And I think, Grace, we said that we might have a way to share this at some point with families, but
Yeah.
one is called, sometimes it's called a homeschool report card. Sometimes it's called a daily behavior report card. So it looks sort of like, I don't know if you can see this much at all on this camera here. Right, sort of looks like this.
Let me see if I can share my screen here.
So what it does is you make columns with some specific goals, right? So it might be, I will stay in my seat. I will have listening ears, right, for your little kids, or I will try my best, or something like that. So you pick 2, 3, maybe 4 goals for your older kids. And then what you do is, so that might be across the top of the page, and then along the side of the page, you would put different times of the day or different class periods, right? So you might have reading time, math time, or if you're not dividing it quite that distinctly, you could have 6 to 7 or 1 to 2, kind of your hours laid out. And then what happens is at the end of each of those periods of time, you would take a minute and let them know how they did on each goal during that time period. So like, for example, after reading, we would say, oh, Bobby, you did awesome staying in your seat during reading time, right? And he might earn a smiley face or 2 points, or depending on how old your kid is. Or you might say, ooh, you had a little bit of a hard time making sure you stayed focused, so let's work on that, right? So you might get maybe like a flat face or a 1 point or something like that. And then if it was something you really struggled with, like, oh, it was really hard for you to, I don't know, have listening ears or something like that during that time. So they might earn 0 points or a frowny face, but then you would kind of problem solve, okay, we're going to do math next. What do we need to do to make sure that you can have listening ears during math, right? So the way that works is there's a goal for each day then, right? So many smiley faces or so many points. And then usually there's something they can earn access to, definitely lots of praise from parents, but also things like maybe a, you know, special toy they like to play with, or a little snack, or a little prize box if that's an option, things like that.
Okay.
So homeschool daily report card is awesome. There's also something as far as just keeping attention called self-monitoring. So this is somewhat complex, if you can sort of see this one.
And we'll share these after the broadcast. I can't share my screen right now, but we will get these up in the comments afterwards.
So this is a relatively complex one where basically there's like a time, like an on task and an off task section. So what happens is you just take a kitchen timer and set it off to the side with this paper, and they start doing their work. And then in say 5 minutes, it beeps. And they have to stop when that 5-minute mark hits and mark on their sheet, was I just doing one of these things I was supposed to be doing, or had I gotten off task, right? So that way it does a couple things. It reduces how much they're off task without even realizing it, right? Especially if they're doing independent work. They weren't staring out the window for 10 minutes before they realized. Second, it cuts back on how much parents have to sort of end up in that like nagging situation. Like, what are you doing? Get back to what you're doing. Come on, Bobby, let's go. So it makes just a little bit less conflict. And then the same thing, you can set goals for that where, you know, if they were on task, at first I would start pretty low, maybe 50% of the time, and then kind of slowly build up. Now this week you have to be on task 80% of the time to be able to kind of earn your praise and your reward or whatever that is. So as far as actual tools go, I would encourage parents to look at, they either call it self-monitoring or on-task monitoring, or homeschool report card, or daily report card. Sometimes they call it. Super helpful.
So we are getting some questions and comments from our audience. So let's bring in some of those. So Amber says, how can I get my kid to be interested in doing schoolwork? He will not touch the paperwork, but he will do schoolwork on the tablet. And then later she also says, I can't get him to even begin to touch it, he will choose ABC Mouth over his actual schoolwork.
Well, so I think you're probably running into maybe a couple things. One, of course, right, in this day and age, something on the tablet is a lot more interesting and stimulating, right? Something like ABC Mouse, it's a little more game-based sort of format. That's definitely going to pull their attention in more. So that's probably part of why that's a thing. Second, kind of depending on how old your kid is, if they have some history with, they do the actual printed schoolwork, but then they miss things on it, or they have to erase it because they didn't write neat enough, they might be avoiding it because of that. So I would say you might be at the point where you start with really breaking it down a lot. So maybe our goal at first, right? Yes, our goal is for them to do this whole sheet maybe, but maybe we have to start with, okay, our goal is if you do 2 problems, then you can do ABC Mouse, right? And then maybe we try to build up from there, 2 problems, and then with lots of praise for trying and doing their best, and then they get to do ABC Mouse. And then maybe we do, you know, the whole first line the next day, and then we kind of try to build it up from there. It's maybe sounds a little silly that they don't have to do 2 problems, but trying to start somewhere. And if there's a way you can modify it a little bit, right? Like maybe instead of having to just sit with your pencil and write these words, maybe they can use different colored markers or highlighters, or can they write it on a marker board if you have that at your house, or things like that to try to pull it in and make it a little bit more engaging and interesting in a different way. And trying to maybe working with the teacher to see if that's an option to, if it's okay if it's in, you know, rainbow marker color, or is it okay if they write it on a marker board, but then I write the answer on the paper, or kind of trying to, again, find some ways to make it a little bit more interesting, a little bit more stimulating, a little bit less negative by seeming like it's a lot of information maybe, to try to break it down and start somewhere.
Yeah. And then Lindsay's just sharing on here. She says, when we have a good day, we work ahead and do extra work. So when we have a bad day, we can dial back and do some fun learning things. What are your thoughts on that?
That's a good idea. Kids with ADHD, even though it's kind of a consistent disorder, they do still kind of vary some days versus other days on how well they can focus, or what's going on in their life, or how well they slept, or that sort of thing. So if they are, maybe we start homework at, say, 9 o'clock every day, and if it's a day that they are doing great and can keep it going longer, maybe they can earn some kind of rewards for continuing to work longer. That way you have less the next day. The tricky part might ending up with kids saying, well, yesterday we only had to work until 11 o'clock. Why do we have to work till 1 o'clock today? So, but definitely if you can build in some reward for, oh, you're working great today. How about if we work 1 more hour today, right? We can earn access to this, right? Or maybe they have sheets of paper with so many hours they have to do a week. And if they're focusing okay right now, they can choose to grab another hour and do it right now. That way that's 1 less hour they have to do another day. So trying to find kind of some way to balance it out. I think that's a good idea.
Okay. So we have some people talking about medications. So if kids are on medications, do they still need them?
Yeah, you're cutting out a little bit there, Grace. I don't know if it's you or me, but
I guess for school.
Yeah. So I'm assuming you're asking about doing medications during homeschool versus not. I would say one place is to make sure that you talk to your child's doctor first, right? You never want to stop something without checking with their medical provider that prescribes the medication. But another piece I would say is if you can make homeschool engaging enough that they can focus without it, it might be worth considering. If you, especially if they have side effects from it, it might be worth considering. For me, the part that I would say would definitely mean I wouldn't consider taking it off would probably be something like, maybe you can get them to focus okay during schoolwork without it, but they're a lot more impulsive and do risky things that then might put them physically kind of at risk of hurting themselves if they did something without thinking about it. Or the other balance is, even if they can focus relatively okay if you make it engaging, trying to balance concerns with medications or side effects with medications, with just how frustrated they're going to get and how much extra effort they have to put into it to be able to learn. So I think it's a balance of, if they seem to be able to focus perfectly fine when you make it interesting and stimulating, and it's not such a significant condition for them that then they're engaging in kind of risky, impulsive behavior other times, then it may be worth having that conversation with your doctor if that would be appropriate. But trying to balance, again, definitely if there's any kind of risky behavior when they're not on it, and just trying to balance how frustrating and how much effort are they having to put in, because we don't want them to get to the point that they hate it because they have to work so hard. So I think those are some things to consider, but definitely talking with your medical provider who prescribes the medication about the options.
Okay. And then this will be my last question, unless we get any others from our audience members. Just what are some tips for parents on how they can work with their child's teacher for distance learning for a child with ADHD?
Yeah, I think it depends on what the format is. So if, for example, kind of like I talked about a few minutes ago, if it's, say, worksheets that you're supposed to print and they're supposed to do at home, trying to find out, is there an option for the format it's in, right? Like, do they have to do it on this specific piece of paper, kind of with pencil laid out? Could we make it more interesting with markers, or could we do it on the marker board and then I just write the answer on the paper? Or so you might have to see, is there some flexibility in kind of what it looks like? The other option is, especially if your kid already has like a 504 plan or an IEP, if what they're being asked to do, say they're asked to do, I don't know, 40 math problems, and it's an area that they seem to understand fine, that they don't need extra review in, trying to find if there's an option to do maybe the odd problems or something like that, so that they can show they know it, but not tax the attention too much. Now, that might not be an option depending on kind of what situation you're in and what kind of plans you're on. I would also say, if you're doing live videos with teachers, remember I mentioned physical activity being pretty important. So making sure that you maybe do some time where they're able to get up and move and be physically active before they attempt to sit down to do that kind of live session. Another thing during that live session might be to have some kind of little cards that you could use to cue them without talking, right? Especially if they're going to have their microphone on. You don't want to be correcting them in front of their whole class potentially. So maybe you have a little picture of an ear or a picture of a chair, right? So if they're getting a little loud, something you can kind of hold up and point to from the other kind of side of the computer. Or if they're, getting out of their seat a little bit, kind of being able to point to the chair to direct them back to their seat. So I would say, see if there's flexibility kind of in the format that they do the work, or how much of the work they need to do to show what they know. Definitely try to give some physical activity before live lessons. Try to give some nonverbal reminders during live lessons, like the pictures we talked about.
Yeah.
And just trying to see if there's some flexibility. The parent mentioned earlier, some days they focus better than other days, right? If they're not live, but they are videos they have to watch, do they have to watch the whole video in one setting? Can we break it up? Kind of talking about what are the options for being flexible, I think.
Okay, great. Well, is there anything that I didn't think to ask you that you want to make sure to address for our audience today?
Well, I think that's pretty good. Like I said, I think that the issue is consistency with some choice and flexibility, right? Yes, we might want them to, the ideal is sit still at the table quietly. That might not be an option, so you might have to be a little bit flexible with how they do that. Trying to make sure that you give yourself credit for you're doing everything that you can do. Right? The more you are frustrated with them or with yourself, the worse that's probably going to go. So trying to give yourself some self-care and some breaks and some, your own kind of praise to yourself that I did what I could today, and we'll start fresh tomorrow.
Great. I think we all need to do that for everything right now, right?
Yes.
So, well, thank you so much for joining us and talking about this important topic. We will share those tools in a little bit later on Facebook and in the comments. And if you guys have additional questions, feel free to write them in the comments and we can touch base and respond back. So thank you so much and have a great Friday.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.